everyone, and welcome to another episode of No Bibs, Burps, Bottles. I'm your host, Dr. Angela L. Harris. I'm the founder and visionary of No Bibs, Burps, Bottles. I go by Angela, I go by Doc Sarah. I always tell people to keep it clean. So I want to thank you in advance for listening. I also want to encourage you before we get started to please follow No Bibs, Burps, Bottles. Now, today I have a special guest and I'm so excited. You know, every now and then we like to switch it up here at No Bibs, Burps, Bottles. We do focus on Black African-American women, but we also want to hear from our child-free African-American Black males. And so I'm so delighted to have my friend and also a podcaster, and he does a lot of other things on here, Dr. Earl Turner. And I'm going to let Dr. Turner introduce himself. He has a long bio, and all that information, as well as where you can follow him, will be in the description box. But Dr. Turner, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your career, where you live, and an interesting fact?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm Dr. Earl Turner. I go by Dr. Earl for short. I am licensed as a psychologist by training. I'm currently teaching full-time here in Los Angeles, and I'm an author. I have a book that we may touch on a little bit later, focus on mental health among African Americans. I also have done a podcast as well, focused on issues related to Black boys and men. And I also do a lot of work with media in terms of talking about around awareness for mental health. I think one interesting fact about me, I don't know, it's interesting from my perspective, is that I'm a very introverted person, but given my social media presence, people sometimes don't sort of make that connection. And the interesting thing is that when I was in college, I actually did some work with modeling and acting. And I was in a movie as a background dancer with Jamie Foxx, the story of Ray Charles, which was a really unique and interesting experience that I had.
Yes, and that is an interesting fact. And for all those who are listening and watching this, we'll talk about where you can follow Dr. Turner later, but he is a singer and an actor and a dancer, and he does interior decorating. He does it all. And I love when you are popping up on, Instagram and the stories and singing. I haven't seen a song from you lately, so you must be busy, because I love when you pop in with your songs, but it's just, you like to have fun, and I appreciate that about you. As your life stands today, as an African-American Black male, what does it mean for you to be child-free?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's complicated because I think, like, for me, I, as an adult, didn't always want to not have kids, but I think that sort of shifted as I've gotten older, and I don't have kids now, and I haven't had I'm not pressured to have kids. I feel like I need to do that. As I think a lot of people in society, there's this expectation around that, and it's okay if you want to have kids and if you don't want to have kids. But I think as a society, we oftentimes put a lot of pressure on people to have a family and have kids. And so I think for me, not having kids provides an opportunity for me to really decide what I want to do with my time. And so I think that it's a lot more, it's easier to be able to work long hours or take breaks and travel and spend time with friends and do those types of things, because I don't have that obligation to be responsible for a little person. And I think that for people that do have kids, that sometimes you do have to sort of negotiate, how do you navigate balancing having a child and a family and the time that you give for yourself.
And so with that being said, if you can share with our audience kind of where you stand. And so there's this, you're child-free now. Do you want children in the future? What are those factors that you're going to consider? Or have you made the choice, I do not want children? So where are you today with that?
Yeah, and so going back to my point about it's sort of complicated in that when I was younger and all out through my childhood and growing up, I did want kids. And I can recall as I was sort of thinking about this podcast, when I was in high school, and we had the memory books in high school. We wrote all these things down that we wanted to do in our lives. And I remember writing in my memory book about wanting to have kids, wanted to have a family, I wanted to be a medical doctor, all of those dreams and aspirations that I had at the time. And as I've gotten into psychology, into my profession, and particularly for me specializing in working with children and families, I think when I hit a postdoc and really seeing some of the more difficulties and challenges that come along with parenting and with kids that have, severe behavioral disorders, which is ironically my specialization. I think there was like a light bulb went off for me. It's like, okay, do I want to have kids given the potential that, they can sort of have some of these challenges that as a professional, I am very passionate about helping parents get the tools they need to manage those things. But I was also like conflicted about like, do I want that for my own life in terms of kids? And so I think that sort of put somewhat of a pause on me really thinking about having kids at that time. And as I've gotten older and now into my 40s, I think when I started to hit 30, it began for me to like think about, do I want to be an older dad? And so like I made this thing in my mind with what I do sometimes. I put these expectations on myself that if I don't have a child by the time I'm 30, 35, I don't know if I want to do that because I don't want to be an old dad. And I know that sounds sort of strange, but I think for me, it's like I wanted to be active with a child and be able to do things. And so I think I sort of past 35, I was like, you know what, I don't know if kids are sort of in my future. So that's sort of where I stand right now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And thank you for explaining that. And it's interesting that you say like 30, 35, because I know for women, it's just like at 30, it's just like, you better be married, you better have 2 kids, you better have the house. And women feel this pressure, but you just shared that you started thinking and reflecting kind of where you are at 30 and 35. So do you believe that men experience the same pressure than women in regards to marriage, children, especially at that 30 mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely different in terms of the pressure. I think that women experience a lot more pressure in terms of having kids and a family around that age period that men don't get. I think there's some biological things that obviously play into that. Me not being a woman, like I can't speak to that specifically, but I know that for men, like we can have kids, and there are men that have, kids up into their 50s and 60s and even older than that. And so I think that, for women, they don't have that flexibility. So there is a lot more pressure on them from, I think family and friends to like make decisions about, okay, you're getting to this sort of age, when you're gonna have kids. And I think men don't get that. Specifically, I think it's more of an individual thing in terms of like for men wanting to, if they desire to have a family and kids, most of the time it is, late 20s, 30s that they start to think about that. And that most of them make some decisions that, they're gonna be active in trying to accomplish that particular goal, or they are more open to like, if it happens, it happens. And then I think that there are a handful of men like myself that sort of have a view about, at a certain age, I don't want to be older because I can't be as active as I want to be. And this sort of came up. I don't know if I saw something on social media or where I heard the conversation, but, having another male sort of speak to that concern in terms of like, not wanting to be older and having a child.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you have this background and you help and educate and support parents, right? Have you ever been in a situation where, and I know I've been in a situation where of being an assistant dean at a college where parents are just like, do you have kids? And I'm like, no. And it's just like, oh, you wouldn't understand. And I'm like, well, I don't need to have kids to know that your kid is failing and will flunk this college if they don't get it together. So with you helping parents and helping them support their kids, do you get that question and how have you navigated that, especially with?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I think, one of the things that happened, I would say fairly often when I really got into the field after I finished my graduate training was working with parents either around my age, because I was in my 30s by the time I started practicing and was licensed as a psychologist. And so I think there were some parents that I worked with who were around my age that were asking that question. And then some that were older and asking that question. So I think it was a mixture of like, can you speak to like understanding my experiences, but also I think there was some like ageism sort of in that, particularly for older parents in terms of like, you're younger, or at least appear younger. They didn't know my age. And you also like, do you have kids or not? And so I think that oftentimes that's a concern for parents when it comes to like, working with a therapist, is that do they understand my experience as a clinician and also as a parent? And so I think like for me, it's always been, I don't like being upfront and transparent with my clients about that, and letting them know that it's important for both of us to like work together. Like you have that expertise in terms of understanding your child and your family, but also have this expertise and experience as a clinician and understanding the research and the science around this that I can sort of add. So we're working together. It is not just me like adding this sort of assistance to you because I also have I'm a parent. I think that shouldn't factor into that decision.
Definitely, definitely. So you talked about kind of, friend groups and, parents that you work with, kind of going on along that, your friend group. Are you the only child-free male? Because they're the assumption that every Black man has like at least 5.6 kids somewhere and a couple of baby mamas around the corner. And so when, people maybe encounter someone like you, an adult, grown man, no kids, sometimes people can raise an eyebrow because I know people do that for women. So in your friend group, are you the only child-free male? How do you interact with other brothers that have kids who are brothers who are maybe questioning why don't you have kids?
Yeah, I mean, I think that men have very different experiences than women when it comes to this particular topic. And so I think like it's come up. So going back a little bit, most of my friends are married and have kids, and particularly my heterosexual friends. And I think it's come up on a handful of occasions in terms of like, when am I going to have kids and get married and have a family, etc. But I think, when I say like, I don't know if that's in the cards for me, or I don't know if I want kids or whatever, the conversation tends to like be dropped. And so I think like, particularly I can think back to situations with my fraternity brother in terms of asking that question. I'm like, I don't know if I want kids right now. And so I think that conversation ends quickly. Whereas I think for women, that conversation tends to go on, and like you get all of these follow-up questions, from individuals about sort of why, you should or you should, like you'll be a good mother, all those types of things. I think that it happens a little bit for men, but I don't think it happens as frequent.
And you're so right, Dr. Turner, because just to hear you share that experience, like it's a little question and then it's dropped, opposed to so many women that I've talked to and have experienced it myself, where there's a question like, you're getting older and why, and what's wrong, and what's wrong with you, what's wrong with you? I'd imagine you're not getting what's wrong with you, Earl, because you don't have kids. It seems like it's just a question and you kind of move on from it. How would you respond though if there was a little pressure?
I mean, I had never thought about that question, and it hasn't happened. I mean, I think again, like I said, I've gotten the question, but I haven't been like badgered about like why, what's wrong with you, like you should, all these other things. I think like for me, it's about like personal choices and decisions, and so I think as an individual, but also like as a therapist, like letting people know like your decisions are your decisions. Like it can be difficult sometimes because of these expectations that we have as a society. But I think ultimately it's your decision. And so I think like, a different conversation, but when we talk about like relationships, I think people oftentimes want to like add their 2 cents into like what your relationship should be like. No, what do you and your partner want your relationship to be like? So I think it's the same thing for kids. And for me, I would just say, it's my decision. Like I have to live with that. You don't.
And a lot of times that's how I coach and really encourage women to do the same thing. If you want to explain your story, whatever it is, by all means do so. But again, we also need to let people know that they need to stay out of our business, whether it's from a male perspective or the uterus of a female, right? So I appreciate you kind of sharing that. So let's talk a little bit about family. So you're like, I think I'm okay being child free. What about your parents and your cousins and them, and people wanting you to extend the Turner name? So tell me about, are your parents wanting to be grandparents?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was so focused on education in school. I think all out through my 20s and until I graduated grad school, like it wasn't a topic of conversation. I think when I finished my degree, it came up like once or twice in terms of like, when am I going to have kids? When am I going to get married, et cetera? And as I've continued in my career, like that is not a conversation that comes up often. I'll also say that I am the oldest of three kids. And so I do have nieces and nephews. And so my mom is a grandmother. And so I think that because she has grandkids that are like taking up her time and she's enjoying the time that she's spending with them and making memories, that it hasn't been, focused on me in terms of like, okay, now, when is this going to happen? I want grandkids type of thing. Particularly since I'm the oldest
Mhm.
of three. And so I think in that situation, now that she does have grandkids, it hasn't been something that has come up. And I don't get pressure from other family members about it.
Okay. And so it seems like your story is similar to other women that I've talked to and other people that I've talked to, where there was this trajectory of career, right? Graduate school, career, getting licensed. And for a lot of times, women, we do all of that. And then some of us look up and we're like, ooh, that biological clock has ticked and it's gone because we've been so focused on career. And so with that being said, did you have a plan? So even though you're saying, I don't want to be an older dad, was there a plan of, if I have kids, I want to do it in this kind of right way, marriage, kids, house?
Yeah, I mean, I think like going back to when I was young, I think when I was in college, like my focus was on school and I was definitely, I would say determined. My view was that I did not want to have kids until I was married. And so the plan was to like finish school, get married, have kids, I don't know, quote unquote, traditional sort of route. I don't know if it's traditional anymore because I think people
Exactly.
have and get married at different time points at this sort of current reality. But I think that was sort of my initial plan in terms of my thinking about it. And as I've like dated over the years, definitely, particularly in my 30s, being able to like be upfront about the possibility of whether I would want kids or not. And I don't know if that was like a deal breaker for that potential partner at the time, but it may have been, and maybe they just didn't sort of voice that concern to me. But I think it is a reality that we have to deal with, again, because I think there's so much pressure, put on us from society. So I think it's really important that you are sort of having these types of conversations about being child free.
And so kind of going to the dating, route. And so I know for myself and sisters that I've talked to, it could be a hit or miss. Some women are very, I don't want to date anyone with kids. Some sisters are just like, I'll date you, but your kids need to be grown out the house with their own family. And then some is just like, I don't mind being a stepmom, I don't care if your kid is 4. So as you are, out there in the dating world, or I'm gonna make the assumption that you're, you mentioned dating, but how do you think about that? Are you open to being a stepdad? Do the kids have to be older? Would you date someone who has a 3-year-old? How do you navigate those conversations, especially when being sought after or pursuing a potential partner?
Yeah, I think this is a tricky question, and I don't know what the conversation has been like before. But I think like when you talk about like this step parent sort of role, that I think some people get pushback when they make statements about like, I don't want to raise anybody else's child sort of thing. And again, I think that that's their decision. And so I think like for me, um, I've definitely been in I don't know, the view of like, if I'm going to date somebody, I would prefer if they didn't have kids. I think that if they, and for me, the reason why, in terms of if they had kids and I was dating them, is that I just think it gets tricky. Like, then I have to figure out, and we have to negotiate, like, what is the relationship with that child's, dad? Do they get along with each other? Is it like, are they going to be confrontational with me? And I just don't have the mental energy to deal with that. And so I think that's sort of what factored into my decision about that. I think as I've gotten older, the other piece of it is that 50% chance that if I do marry and decide to do that, that person may have kids already at this, potential age, if I'm dating someone that's, similar in age. And so I think that's a reality that I have to sort of accept. And then, when the time comes, have to sort of negotiate, like, how old is this child? Am I comfortable? I think that, for me being someone that does work with kids, like I love kids. It's not anything that I don't like kids. And so that is not the reason why I haven't decided to have kids. I do love kids, and I love spending time with my nieces and nephews, and other, younger cousins that have kids, their kids. But I think that if I had to date someone that had kids, I would prefer not to, but it would definitely have to be like, we have to have a conversation about like, what is the relationship like with the child's parent? Are they going to be also okay, with me stepping into that sort of parental role? Because I think that's also another sticky point. Like some people feel like you're not going to, raise my kid or discipline my kid. And I think that that's tricky, because if that child is primarily in the home with me and my partner, and we're raising that child, like I have a say in raising that child. And again, it gets tricky.
Yes, it does. It does. It does. And your answer and your transparency is similar to other stories in regards to like everyone has kind of what their deal breakers are. And some people come out right and say like, you have kids, sorry, that's not where I'm at. And then some people are open to dating people with kids or older or younger. So I appreciate you sharing that. Hey, I'm stopping my own YouTube video and podcast episode to let you know about NoBibsBurpsBottles.com. That's right, stop and visit our website today. We have a bunch of awesome child-free pride merchandise made especially for you. Visit NoBibsBurpsBottles.com today. Peace. What are some of the assumptions or stereotypes that you've heard of, or you can make up now, about child-free men? Because child-free women, it's like we're an old maid, or something's wrong with your insides, and you must be crazy, and so what are some of the stereotypes, or what's said about child-free men?
Again, I think like women have a different experience. I don't recall like getting any of those negative statements, at least personally, about my decision to not have kids. And I can't recall of the men that I know that get those types of remarks in terms of their decisions about not having kids. I think it is I think as a society, like we're so much, we're so less likely to like pressure men about having kids, that when they make those decisions, it's like, okay, it's not a big deal if you don't have kids. And so I think that sort of has been my experience. I think there's the expectation, again, like you sort of mentioned earlier, that at a certain age that you should have kids. And so I think that comes up. Or sometimes I think for men that don't have kids, like, okay, are you gay? Like that sometimes comes up. But we know like gay men also want kids. So I don't understand like why that even comes up, sometimes when it does for people. But I think that's probably the only thing that I've heard in terms of, when men don't have kids, is they start to question, or people start to question, their sexuality in that situation. But for me, like I haven't gotten any, like if I tell people that I don't have kids, like it's like, it's a non-issue.
Mm-hmm. And I've heard those, when I've asked this question, or, if it's on Instagram or social media, those assumptions, whether it's the sexuality or whether you're just a player, you're out there just trying to smash everything, so that's why you don't have kids now. And also, I think it might not be a big issue because like you said, men, if everything is right, you can have a child at 60, obviously with maybe someone younger, and you don't have to think about those fertility issues. So this space is No Bibs Burps Bottles, where we celebrate African-American Black child-free women. And I'm so delighted to have you on. There's something that I share that says people will see that I'm a brown girl. People will see that you're a brown face man before they know either one of us are child-free. So when I say that to you, what are some reactions? And more specifically, I'm trying to get to that cultural piece. So just what comes up for you, thoughts or reactions when I say that?
I think there's the assumption that I do have kids. I think that always comes up. I think, Father's Day comes around and it's like, oh, happy Father's Day. Well, I don't have kids, but thank you. So I think that happens. Again, like going back to the point that you made earlier, like once you get a certain age, I think particularly in your 30s, that there's this assumption that as an adult male, particularly and I'll speak in the context of Black men, that you have kids. And so I think that's something that I navigate often, even for, again, in clinical situations when I'm doing therapy, that assumption comes up, quite often, or the marriage question. So I think those are like some assumptions that people just sort of have.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And because of your background in mental health and being a licensed psychologist, I'm curious to also know if a woman was to present with certain issues in regards to just being ambivalent about having a child. So maybe she wants to be child free, but she's getting pressure from her partner, or the parents want grandkids. Can you share a little bit about how just generally how you would work with someone who may be struggling, male or female, who's like, I want to be child free, but maybe I should have a baby to appease everyone else? How would you work with them?
Yeah, I mean, I think like going back to the point that I brought up earlier is like, what is important to you? Like, what do
Mm-hmm.
you want? And so I think really having that discussion with that individual or with that couple to say, what are the reasons why you want to have kids? Like, what is that adding to your life? And if you don't want kids, like, what are the reasons for that? Can you express to your partner about how do you value your time and what you want to do or what you want to do together as a couple that can be impacted by bringing a child into the world? And so I think that, for me, I am a very practical, realistic person outside of sort of my professional role. And so I think like for people really sitting with those decisions that you make and like, what is going to bring you joy and happiness?
Mm-hmm.
And if it's the piece that for that person that wants to be child free, like that brings you joy and happiness, then you have to own that. And the person that you're dating or in a relationship with that wants to get married or is married is struggling with that, then that may be the decision that you both have to make about, moving forward apart, because you both like different things bring you both joy. And if for the other person that wants to have kids, that is going to bring them joy, then that's going to impact that joy for that person. And so I think having that tough conversation that sometimes you have to have, particularly for me as a therapist that's working with couples.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That you're dropping such good nuggets here. So, and I just love the seeing the other side, because I think there's healthy conversations that can be had around, child-free men and child-free women, and just you demonstrating today just your experiences and how they're so vastly different from mine, but also being in the position that being a therapist and, possibly having to deal with it if you have not already. And so in regards to this concept of child free, right? I didn't know anything about child free when I knew I didn't want kids, but I kind of came into my own and I feel comfortable in the space now. But there are a lot of women who are just like, what? Okay, I don't have any kids. What's the big deal? So when I say child free, this child free lifestyle, this child free empowerment, was that something that you knew you were doing, or was it just not even on the radar? This whole child-free thing.
Yeah, I don't think it was on the radar. I didn't even know that it was as big as it is. And I think not until I came across your podcast and I've seen, other things on social media, recently about it. I didn't know that there were so many people that were talking about this conversation about being child-free. I just knew that there was pressure, from society. I think like for me as a psychologist by training, like I know that society has a lot of expectations about how we live our lives. And I think for me as an individual, I've always been like outside of that box, or wanting to like not be placed in that box rather, because I feel like I don't want to be pressured by other people's expectations. And so I think that can be really difficult for people. And so I really love the idea that you're celebrating people making a decision that they don't want to have kids. They're not going to be pressured by society to have kids, and they're going to do what brings them joy and happiness. And that may include, not having a child, even if they want to be married.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And here's a kind of a off the grid question. So I was talking to a couple and they're not having children, and the male was talking about, having a vasectomy. And recently, guilty pleasure, I watched Love and Hip Hop, and there was an exchange between young Jock and his fiance, I think it's his wife now, where she was just like, I'm not having kids. You need to get a vasectomy. And he's just like, that's taking away my manhood. And she's like, dude, you already have like a lot of kids by different women. But he really was honed in on this is taking away my manhood. And so in regards to why is that so important? Because in regards to in order to decrease, people having kids and not wanting them or having regrets if they have a termination, it's easier for a man to take care of that opposed to the pressures of a woman having to have like full surgery, hysterectomy. So as a psychologist, or maybe even personally, can you talk about like why that is so big for men, and even specifically Black men, like, ooh, vasectomy, and I'm no longer a man if that happens?
Yeah, I mean, so I am not an expert. I'm not a medical doctor, so I can speak to
Just your
the
opinion.
specifics around that. I personally have not had a vasectomy. I do know of someone who has had a vasectomy, and that was after he had kids, but he didn't want more kids. And so I think, again, like going back to your point, I think like there's some biological things I think that are tied to that. And so like as a male, like this is what your body does. And so I think that for men, that we don't want to change things about our body is just natural. And so I think like a whole different conversation, but when we talk about like health and fitness, I think Will Smith's this whole thing about sort of body image concerns in men, I think that as men get older, like there's a lot of acceptability around like men just like, hey, gaining weight and like accepting their body the way that it is. And women get a lot more pressure, I think, when it comes to like body image things. And so I think when it comes to like the whole vasectomy type of conversation and like manhood and masculinity, there's like, oh, this is who I am, like this is what I do. I may sort of take steps to like not have kids, which might include some types of contraception. But that part of like getting the vasectomy is like it's not going to happen type of issue, I think, for a lot of men. And I think there may be some like concerns about like what happens when you do get a vasectomy in terms of like hormones and testosterone. And again, I'm not an expert, so I can't speak to that, but I think that for some men, there may be some concerns about like, what is that going to do to my body if I do get a vasectomy?
Definitely. Thank you for sharing that and sharing your opinion on that. And so I know I've asked this question regarding representation of the just child-free women, child-free men. And do you see a representation of child-free men, whether that's print, radio, I think marketing, there's this pushing out of family and kids that you see on commercials and TV shows. So what comes to mind as far as representation of yourself? What comes to mind?
I mean, it's rare, I'll say that, that you see those depictions of men who are child-free, unless it is like a situation that you mentioned before where they are portrayed as being like the player, the womanizer type thing, and they're not interested in settling down. And so I think that there's a disconnect between, and not just for men, but I think a disconnect in society where if you don't want to have kids, and that means that you don't want a family and like a partner, and being able to sort of settle down. And I think that that's not the case for a lot of people that make decisions to be child free, is that they do want to have a partner, have a relationship. It's the other piece in terms of like birthing a child or having a child that they make decisions about. And so I think that those are the pieces in terms of like what I see in terms of that, and just sort of my own recollection of when I see things on TV or even in, print types of ads, that's sort of what comes up for me.
Because again, there's this, I don't want to say marketing ploy, but again, we're based on family, right? It's the structure really of man, woman, kids. And we all know that they're different. Families look very different, right? And family does not necessarily mean birthing or having a child. So thank you for sharing that.
And I think just to add to that too, I think, for me as a child psychologist, that I definitely see like sometimes when it comes to like media interviews and requests, is that if you're a single male, that there are certain types of stories that they may want to like interview you about. I think I've been very successful in terms of the work that I've done with the media, but I do take note of certain types of topics, and even some of my colleagues that are married and have kids that are doing this type of work, that there are some differences that sort of show up in terms of that piece too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so here's another question for you, Dr. Turner. So a lot of times, for some women, this space is, more so child-free by choice. But again, the child-free community is so large where you also have couples and people who desire children, but they're infertility or fertility issues. And there's always the assumption that it's the woman, where we also know that men can have fertility issues. So generally speaking, your thoughts about being child-free, and men considering adoption, foster care, especially if they have those issues, but want children. So just your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think for me, again, not from personal experiences, but from things that I've sort of seen either through television or in media, is that for men, if they do want to have kids, but there may be some fertility issues with them, being able to make that happen, that is sort of going back to sort of these manhood issues, like I'm not sort of man enough or being concerned about that, as opposed to being open to the idea of adoption, for example. I think that for men, if they can't have a child that has their own DNA, that can be really tough for a lot of them in terms of being open to having a kid. And so that may sort of lead them into deciding, because of that issue, that they want to be child free because they can't produce a child of their own. And so I think those are some of the things that sort of come up for me in terms of my understanding of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Are you confident in being child free? Do you think if you met the right person, the right situation, the stars align, that someone could say, we are meant to be, let's have little Turners, like, where are you? Because sometimes, and I tell people this all the time, that you could be proudly child free today, but then also change your mind, So I don't tell people never have kids, but I just say embrace where you are today.
Yeah, I think again, like this is something that I was sort of reflecting on as you sort of invited me to be on the podcast, was that, well, what if I do this interview and then something changes down the road, and like, okay, were you on this podcast a couple years ago? You're sort of living in the moment and not wanting to have kids, and now you have a kid or whatever, sort of happens. So I think like for me, obviously, like I can't predict the future and sort of what would happen in terms of that. I sort of spent some time earlier talking about, for me, like the age and being an older dad is something that definitely has been something on my mind since my 30s. And so I think like for me, that would definitely require me to like do some self-reflection. If I met someone that wanted to have kids, to be like, okay, do I want to now decide at my, 50s or whatever to, let's say, have a kid? I mean, I still have some time in my 40s, but if something changes, that I would have to definitely do some thinking about that. Because again, like, I think there's a lot of things that would have to factor into me considering bringing a child into this world. And, can I do the things that I would really want to do with that child? And then I think that the other piece that I've definitely thought about before is that if I met someone who, let's say, she was really wanting to have kids and like I was really in love, I think that there's a possibility that my decision could change. And I sort of brought up the decision before that. I was dating someone years ago, and sort of became like, I think in my mind at that time, I was like, I don't want to have kids. But this person was really like, okay, they were really very vocal about, wanting to like have their legacy, so to speak, at some point. And I just wasn't there. But I think like over the time of us like dating, I started to like, would I consider like at some point to maybe do that? That relationship didn't sort of, go anywhere. But I think like that's a decision, I think, for many people, that if you really fall in love with somebody, like you may change your mind.
Exactly.
And so I think like for me, like there's a possibility, but at this point, it's not something that I'm feeling pressured about, and I'm not going to like beat myself up because I'm a male in my 40s. I don't have a child.
Yeah, and if you happen to have little Turners in the next few years, you are child free in this space and time, and that's okay, because people do change their mind. Relationships and love, it does something to you. So it's okay where we are now, and it will be okay where you are in the future. So, but speaking about legacy, Dr. Turner, again, the narrative of society, you get married, you have kids, you have a dog, picket fence, life goes on, you leave your worldly possessions and all your money and everything that you have to your kids. That's kind of how it's set up. You and I are child free. And if we remain, well, I'll remain child free, but if you remain child free, like what is Dr. Turner's legacy going to look like?
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely thought about that question. And so I think like for me, having nieces and nephews is something that I have actively thought about, and really the plan, if I remain child free, again, only God knows what'll happen in regards to that. But if I do, I think like that would be my legacy. So I think really fostering my relationships with them, really thinking about like if even going to the point of like thinking about like getting stocks in their names and things like that. Like I've thought about those types of things. And so I think for me, that's sort of my vision in terms of what my legacy will be, in terms of the things that I instill in them as kids, and what I may have, sort of to leave behind.
And I want to go back to this because it's funny in a sense where I know for myself and other people that I've talked to, it's just like, I don't want to be an older parent, like your back is hurting, you want to sleep in. But what is it for you, like being an older dad? Like what stands out about that for you when you're like, I really don't want to be an older dad?
I mean, I'm somewhat active now as an adult in terms of like being out running, for example, and doing things like that. And so I think for me, the type of dad that I would have liked to be or would like to be, if something happened in the next year or two before I got older. I don't see that happening right now, but anyway, so I think like me wanting to like go outside and like play with them and run with them and, do maybe some sports activities or teach them some things and have them to like at least try things out to see if they like it. Those would be the things that I like to do. And I think part of that for me, would be, I think for us as adults and for those that have kids, that we look back on our childhood or the things that we liked and didn't like, and what would we like to sort of give to a potential child or don't want to give to a child, given potential experiences that we've had. And that doesn't always sort of factor into people's decisions to not have kids. But I think like for me, I didn't really do a lot of stuff like that with my parents when I was growing up. And they like were very supportive of me of anything that I wanted to do. But I think like I was a very sedentary, I would say, child in terms of like being inside and like playing video games. And I was also like an only child for like a very long time before I had siblings. And so I think for me, it's about like, I would really love to like go outside, play basketball, throw footballs. If it's a girl, do some jump ropes, or even girls maybe do some basketball. So I think like I would like to do those types of activities, with kids. And so that for me was why I didn't want to be like an older dad.
And that's important because you and I both know that there are older individuals who are having children. Everyone wants to throw out Janet Jackson and all these other people who are 50 and 55 having kids. And I'm thinking, well, I don't have Janet Jackson money and neither do you. So keep it close. Any regrets, anything that you would do differently today?
I think if I don't regret it, I think like things have worked out the way that they should work out. I think the only thing I would potentially have done differently was that maybe dated more in my 20s. I think like for me, it's just like I was so focused on school, like that I was very tunnel vision. And so I think that for me, that may have been the thing that I would have done differently. And who knows how that would have shaped my life at this point. But I don't have any regrets about that.
Because you are where you are today. So that's good. That's good. Well, Dr. Earl Turner, I have appreciate you sharing your child-free journey with us. So I want to give you the opportunity to share with our audience, No Bibs, Burps, Bottles, the great things that you are doing. I know already how awesome you are, but please let our audience know just about your podcast, just, your work as a psychologist, and anything else that you would like to plug. And please make sure you share your social media as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, thank you for having me on to talk about this topic. And I learned some things in terms of even like having this discussion about sort of being child free, and also about myself and my views on being child free. But if there are therapists or clinicians that are listening, as I mentioned at the very beginning, I'm an author. I wrote a book 2019, I think the book was released, Mental Health Among African Americans, Innovations in Research and Practice, which is the book that you see here. And so it really is a guide that is helpful for clinicians in terms of understanding cultural responsive practices, understanding the importance of culture with working with Black African American clients, and really just sort of challenging us as a field to really think about sort of how do we integrate culture into treatment. And so I've done some workshops around that topic and presentations to organizations around that, and really talking about sort of racism and racial trauma and sort of how does that impact mental health. And obviously, in the current context of society, like we're dealing with a lot of things in terms of our mental health. And so that's talked about in that book. And I've published some other things as well around sort of mental health and discrimination and racism. So if you're a clinician or therapist or a student, you can check out my website, drerlangerturner.com. That's DRERLANGERTURNER. And you can find more about my research and my work there. I have gear, which I'm wearing here, Black, Educated, and Mental.
Which I have one. I need to take a picture with your shirt on for you.
I appreciate you for supporting the movement. And so for me, it's about bringing awareness around mental health in the Black community. And so I have shirts and hoodies and mugs. And so you can find those on my website as well. And you can connect with me on social media at Dr. Earl Turner. I'm Dr. Earl Turner on all platforms. You can learn more about mental health awareness and about my work and different types of events that I do, either hosting Instagram Lives or Facebook Lives around a number of different topics as well.
Can you share a little bit about your podcast and some of the guests that you've had on as well?
Sure. So the podcast is The Breakdown with Dr. Earl. You can again, find out about that on my website or on social media. Really talked about a variety of topics. I've had the pleasure of having you on this show to talk about self-care and religious practices. And so we've talked about a variety of topics on the show. The podcast primarily focuses on issues related to boys and men, but I've had female guests on the show. We've talked about broad issues that impact mental health in the Black community. I've had Dr. Alfre Breedlove-Noble to talk about, her work on there. I've had Dr. Jonathan Lasseter to talk about sort of LGBT concerns with Black boys and men and connecting that to intersectionality and spirituality and how does that impact Black LGBT community. I've also talked about, imposter syndrome and anxiety and depression. And so it's a whole host of topics that I discussed on the podcast.
I love it. I love it. Well, for everyone who's listening, if you didn't catch all of that will be in the description box of the podcast, as well as Dr. Turner's bio and where you can follow him. So again, I want to thank my friend and Dr. Earl Turner for just sharing your perspective, which is very unique because I do think they're vastly different and there's similarities as well. But thank you for joining us today. I want to encourage you guys to continue to follow our podcast, No Bibs, Burps, Bottles. Again, please follow us on Instagram where we engage a little bit more, No Bibs, Burps, Bottles, as well as our YouTube channel, No Bibs, Burps, Bottles, and all of that will be in the description box. And so until we meet again, I always share this with you. Womanhood is not synonymous with motherhood. And because we have Dr. Turner here, manhood is not synonymous with fatherhood. Until we meet again, thank you so much. Peace.